as heads of our government to discuss that partnership. Now, I'm not pretending those discussions will be easy or they won't proceed in a straight line. There'll be zigs and zags, ups and downs. But as I said in my remarks, I will fight for the best deal for Canada and only accept the best deal for Canada and take as much time that's necessary.
That was Prime Minister Mark Carney today, managing expectations for his meeting next week with U.S. President Donald Trump. Carney says he wants to get a deal for Canada, but he isn't saying that will happen on Tuesday when he heads to Washington. The central issue of that meeting will be the ongoing trade war with the U.S., which continues to have negative impacts on this side of the border. General Motors announcing this morning it's cutting a full shift at its Oshawa assembly plant this fall. It's expected to impact hundreds of workers at the plant and many more at suppliers, a move that the union calls reckless.
I just express my deepest sympathy for them and their families. A very difficult time. We are committed to supporting workers. All the dollars from our tariffs going to support workers. Fighting hard for our auto sector, all our sectors in these negotiations with the Americans, and making sure that companies act in true partnership as well in maintaining employment and investment in Canada. And if not, there will be consequences for those companies.
So there is a lot riding on that meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney. Now, Carney has also said the relationship as we know it between the two countries is over. So should Canadians temper their expectations? Joining me now to talk more about this is the last U.S. ambassador to Canada, David Cohen. Ambassador, welcome back to Power Play.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and I smile as you say that. It wasn't that long ago, and there certainly felt like happier days, although there were plenty of days when people were upset with me and President Biden as well, and there may be a little bit of a moral to that story that every day isn't going to be happiness and sunshine, but that doesn't mean that happiness and sunshine can't return overall.
Certainly, and we are thrilled to have you back here. And I wanted to ask you about how President Trump has been speaking glowingly of Prime Minister Carney in the lead up to this meeting, especially when you compare it to how Trump spoke about former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Do you take this as a signal of a resetting of the relations between the two countries?
So I need to start with a qualifier, which I know you know, which is I'm no longer the U.S. ambassador to Canada, so I can't speak officially for the United States, and I certainly can't speak officially for President Trump. But I'm a big believer that relationships matter. It is the beginning of any conversation, and the beginning of any relationship is any personal chemistry and personal respect that may exist between leaders. And although I don't want to speculate as to causes or the impact of this, I think it's pretty clear that President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau did not have the greatest of relationships. And it certainly seems like there's a much better relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Carney, a relationship that seems to be based on more respect. I've seen speculated here in the United States that President Trump tends to respect leaders who come from a business background, as he did. And obviously, Mark Carney has a distinguished record in business. And Prime Minister Trudeau was a lifelong elected official with no business background. And I think you've seen the way in which the president talks about Mark Carney seems to reflect that respect. He said it at this week's cabinet meeting with his cabinet, that he'd spoken with Prime Minister Carney, who seemed to be a nice gentleman. He has only referred to Mark Carney as the Prime Minister, not as governor. So I think there is all sorts of evidence that there is at least the beginning of a respectful and civil relationship between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump, and that has to be good for getting this relationship back to a decent footing.
So when you consider what has happened to other world leaders who have sat in that Oval Office next to President Trump, What do you think that Prime Minister Carney has to be careful of going in there?
Well, of course, I haven't been physically in any of those meetings, and I will admit to not, for my mental health, not watching cable news 24 hours a day, which is something I did in a different part of my life. So I can't even say that I've seen everything. But, my advice to anyone meeting with the President of the United States, with any President of the United States, is to be respectful, and to approach the meeting understanding that President Trump has objectives that he needs to achieve for the American people. But by the same token, there is nothing wrong with being firm and being clear in the interests of Canada that Prime Minister Carney wants to and needs to represent. The language I've seen Prime Minister Carney use seems to me to be about as perfect a set of language as you can have, which is to make clear to the president that he's going to stand up for Canada's interests. Doesn't mean that you have to be disrespectful or uncivil in having those discussions. It doesn't mean that you can't praise the importance and the value of the relationship between our two countries, and the many good things that have happened between the United States and Canada, and the value that the United States brings to Canada, as well as the value that Canada brings to the United States. And so, and a sincere desire to have a conversation about what this relationship should look like. And I think that's the right way and the best way to approach President Trump as well.
But when you hear Prime Minister Carney say that the relationship as we know it is over, what does that signal to you about what Canada's frame of mind is going into this and what success looks like coming out of it?
So I have enormous respect for Prime Minister Carney. I met him obviously before he was Prime Minister. I think he ran a great campaign. I think he has an incredible grasp of financial and economic issues. I think he demonstrated that in his first-time election, he has an equally incredible grasp of politics and how to conduct politics and foreign affairs. It doesn't mean that I'm going to agree with absolutely every word that he says. And I have said that I think an absolutist statement like the relationship between Canada and the United States is over is probably a bit of an overstatement. It may feel like it's over today, which is an important data point for President Trump and for Americans.
Yeah, and in fairness, Ambassador, he says the relationship as we know it is over. And I just want to make sure that that is clear for everyone.
Right.
Because
we've talked before. I've been on this show many times. I think I've developed a bit of a reputation of being a glass half full kind of a guy and not a glass half empty kind of a guy. And I have an abiding expectation and hope and aspiration that the relationship between Canada and the United States can be put back together into being a strong, productive, positive relationship. And I think that Prime Minister Carney's comments are meant, if for nothing else, but to set an expectation on the United States side about how strongly Canada feels about how they're being treated by the United States. By the same token, a lot of the fears of horrible tariffs, by way of example, just to take one issue, have actually not come to pass for Canada. There were no reciprocal tariffs imposed on Canada, certainly nothing like 145% tariffs like the tariffs that were imposed on China. Even the automobile tariffs, which is Canada's number one or number two industry, depending on the day on which you do the calculation. There were exemptions put in on the 25% tariffs for trade pursuant to the USMCA. And even last night, the president announced not even a moratorium, but the cessation of tariffs on automobile parts that we're going across our border subject to USMCA. So there've been a lot of announcements. There've been a lot of significant tariff announcements. I think I challenge anyone to give me a definitive answer as to exactly what tariffs that have been announced apply to Canada at this point, because it is a bit of a moving target, and it shows, I think, I mean, if I were Prime Minister Carney, I would look at all that, and it shows a certain flexibility and willingness by President Trump to have rational discussions about a trade deal and a trade relationship between Canada and the United States.
Ambassador, we're going to have to leave it there, but I did want to underline that the reason that we keep having you on is because of that glass half full attitude. I appreciate your candor. I appreciate your time as well. And thank you for being with us, former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Canada, David Cohen.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you taking the time.
I know we're out of time. If I could just do one quick thing, which I think is important for me to say, and hopefully once he settles in, you'll have a chance to do this. I do think Ambassador Hoekstra is a good man, will be an excellent United States ambassador for Canada. He has President Trump's ear, and he has an ability to talk with him. And I've been extremely impressed in all of my conversations with him. I know when he was announced, people pointed out that there was optimism. He's from Michigan, which is a border state, and that there was a hope that he understood the importance and the nuance of the U.S.-Canada relationship. And I will tell you that in my conversations with him, that prediction is absolutely true. And I think you'll find, and Canadians will find, that you've just got an excellent representative of President Trump serving as the U.S. ambassador to Canada.
And I appreciate you adding that, Ambassador. Thanks so much, and take care of yourself.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on.